The Desert's Secret, a Roswell 1947 story. The desert of southeastern New Mexico had its own kind of quiet, a stillness so deep it felt older than time. It was July 2, 1947, and the air over the plains shimmered under the afternoon sun. To the west, towering thunderheads brewed like restless giants, their dark underbellies pulsing with flashes of heat lightning. Mac Brazel sat tall in the saddle, his horse's hooves crunching over dry tufts of grama grass. At 51, he'd spent most of his life on ranches just like this one, and storms were nothing new. But something about this one unsettled him. It wasn't the wind, it was the way the clouds seemed to churn unnaturally, like something was stirring them from within. By evening, the storm arrived with a vengeance. Rain swept across the plains in heavy sheets, drumming against the tin roof of his modest ranch house. Lightning forked so bright it lit up the far hills, and each rumble of thunder rolled like a cannon shot. Then, above the wind, Mac heard it, a sharp, metallic tearing sound, unlike any clap of thunder he'd ever known. It came once, twice, then faded. Sleep didn't come easily that night. When dawn finally broke, the sky was washed clean and blue, the desert smelling of wet earth. Mac saddled up early to check on the sheep scattered across his grazing land. The storm had driven them far from their usual pasture. He found them bunched together, uneasy, as if something had spooked them. It was then he saw it, a long, jagged trail of debris cutting through the grassland. The pieces glittered in the morning light, strange strips of silvery metal, thin as paper yet impossibly strong when he tried to bend them. Some bore symbols, small, geometric shapes in purple and blue, the likes of which he had never seen. Kneeling, Mac picked up a fragment the size of his hand. It felt light, almost weightless, and when he crushed it in his palm, it sprang back to its original shape without a crease. Not aluminum, not steel, nothing he knew. The more he looked, the stranger it became. There were beams, two slender rods with an odd texture, almost like wood, yet warm to the touch. No scorch marks, no obvious signs of fire or explosion. Just a field littered with impossibilities. Mac's horse snorted nervously, stepping backward. Even the sheep wouldn't cross near the larger pieces. The desert, so often filled with the sound of insects and wind, seemed eerily silent. For a long moment, Mac just stood there, holding that alien scrap, the hairs on his arms rising. He didn't know it yet, but this was the moment that would place him and the little town of Roswell at the center of a mystery that would never truly fade. He stuffed a few of the smaller pieces into his saddlebag, intending to show them to his neighbors in town. Maybe someone would know what they were. Maybe it was some kind of experimental plane, or something else. Whatever it was, it hadn't come from any place he recognized. And somewhere out there, past the horizon, the rest of it and whatever it had carried was still waiting. The ride back to the ranch house was slow. Mac Brazel kept glancing at the saddlebag, as if the strange debris inside might vanish if he didn't keep an eye on it. His horse, usually steady, flicked its ears and tossed its head whenever the bag shifted. By the time he reached the porch, the sun had burned away the last traces of morning cool. The desert heat pressed in, but Mac's mind wasn't on the weather. He pulled the pieces from the bag and laid them on the worn wood table outside. The thin, silvery sheet caught the light in odd ways. It didn't just reflect, it seemed to drink in the sunlight and give it back in a muted glow. He ran his fingers over the smooth surface again, trying to find a seam or a flaw. Nothing. It was as if the thing had been poured into existence in one perfect mold. The beams were stranger still. They looked like they'd been crafted with precision far beyond the rough metalwork of farm equipment or even the aircraft parts he'd seen on trips to the city. The faint markings, those purple geometric shapes, reminded him of some kind of code. Not letters. Not numbers. Just patterns. Later that day, he stopped by his neighbor Floyd's place, a small adobe farmhouse half a mile away. Floyd, a wiry man with a permanent squint, was sitting on the porch sharpening a knife. Found something after the storm, Mac said, pulling the metal sheet from his saddlebag. Floyd took it, bending it this way and that. What in the blazes? It's light as paper. He tried to crumple it. It sprang back instantly. I've never seen anything like this. You say there's more? A whole field of it, Mac said. Stretched for maybe 100 yards. Like something came apart in the air and scattered all over. You think it's from the air base? Mac hesitated. The Roswell Army airfield was about 30 miles north. Planes from there often flew over the desert. But this didn't feel military. If it is, Mac said slowly, it's something they haven't told us about. By the next day, word had spread to the sheriff's office. Sheriff George Wilcox was a practical man, not prone to flights of fancy. He came out to the ranch with his wife in tow, both curious to see the wreckage. Wilcox turned the metal over in his hands. Never saw anything like it in my life, he said. I'm gonna have to let the Army know about this. That was the moment the story began to slip from Mac's control. The Army didn't just send a single man. They sent trucks, a squad of uniformed soldiers, and 2 officers with the kind of tight, expressionless faces Mac associated with people who carried secrets for a living. The men moved quickly, roping off the area and ordering Mac to keep his distance. They collected every scrap, loading them into heavy crates. Not a single piece was left behind. Even the smallest fragment was swept up, as if each shard was priceless. One of the officers, a tall man with sharp eyes who introduced himself only as Major Marcel, asked Mac to show exactly where he'd found the first pieces. They spoke little on the walk, and Marcel took notes in a small leather-bound pad. When it was over, the Major shook Mac's hand firmly, thanked him, and suggested not quite in the tone of a request that he avoid talking to anyone about what he'd seen. That night, from his porch, Mac watched the distant glow of Army trucks heading north. Whatever the strange metal had been, it was no longer his mystery. But it was far from over. By sunrise the next day, Roswell felt different. It wasn't just the heat haze rising from the asphalt or the smell of dust in the air. It was the sound, or rather, the absence of it. No chatter from the street corners, no dogs barking at passing cars. Just a strange, heavy quiet, as if the whole town was holding its breath. Mac Brazel hadn't planned on going into town, but curiosity pulled him there. He wanted to see if anyone else had heard about the wreckage. He tied his horse outside the sheriff's office, only to find George Wilcox standing in the doorway, arms crossed. They've got the whole area locked down, Wilcox said, without Mac even asking. Army trucks rolled in before dawn. Brought in more men from the base. They've been hauling out crates all morning. Inside the sheriff's office, 2 soldiers in crisp uniforms sat by the desk, their eyes flicking to Mac as he entered. One stood, offered a polite but firm nod, and asked, "You're the rancher who found the debris?" Mac nodded. "Major Jesse Marcel would like you to accompany him to the base," the soldier said. "He has a few more questions." Mac hesitated, glancing at Wilcox. The sheriff gave a small shrug, the kind that said, "You don't really have a choice here." The ride to Roswell Army Airfield was unlike any trip Mac had taken. Military trucks rumbled ahead and behind, soldiers in the back scanning the desert with a precision that felt unnecessary unless they were looking for something. At the base, Mac was escorted into a small office. Major Marcel sat behind a metal desk, the same leather-bound notebook in front of him. Spread out beside it were pieces of the wreckage, the same strange metal, the unbendable sheets, the beams with the cryptic purple markings. "Mr. Brazel," Marcel began, his voice calm, "we appreciate your cooperation. This material is part of a classified project. We'd like to keep its nature confidential for national security reasons." Mac leaned forward. "Major, I've been around airplanes. I've seen bits of wrecks before. This isn't from any plane I've ever seen. You and I both know that. Marcel didn't answer right away. Instead, he picked up one of the thin sheets, twisted it, and let it spring back. You're right, he said finally. It's not like anything you've seen before. And the best thing you can do for yourself and for the country is not to speculate. When Mac left the base that afternoon, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the desert. By the time he returned to town, the news had already broken. At the offices of the Roswell Daily Record, the front page was being set. The bold headline read. It was the story everyone in town was talking about. For the first time, the words flying disc had been printed in black and white. People gathered outside the barber shop, the diner, and the feed store, swapping theories. Some said it was a secret Soviet weapon. Others whispered about visitors from another world. But even before the ink had dried, another story was already in motion. The very next day, a new statement came from the army. The wreckage was not a flying disc at all, but the remains of a weather balloon. The bold headline was replaced with one far smaller, tucked below the fold. Mac knew then that something was being buried fast. And whatever the truth was, the desert wasn't giving it up easily. The shift in the army's story hit Roswell like a sudden cold wind. One day the Daily Record was shouting about flying discs, and the next it was a humble weather balloon. The speed of the reversal was suspicious enough, but what really set tongues wagging was the way the soldiers behaved in town afterward. Mac Brazel noticed it first at the feed store. Two young privates stood near the counter, pretending to browse sacks of grain, but their eyes were fixed on him. When he left, they followed him with that stiff, alert posture soldiers used when they were on duty, even if they weren't wearing it on their sleeves. At the diner, conversations hushed when strangers walked in. People leaned closer over their coffee, voices lowered. Some swore they'd seen unmarked trucks driving through town at night. Others whispered about strange, canvas-covered shapes on flatbeds heading north toward the base. The most unsettling stories came from those who lived closer to the debris field than Mac. Old Mrs. Proctor, a widow who'd been in the area since before the Depression, told anyone who'd listened that she'd seen bright lights darting over the plains 2 nights before the storm. Not planes too fast, too sharp in their movements. Like they were searching for something, she said, her eyes sharp beneath her wide-brimmed hat. Floyd, Mac's neighbor, had his own tale. A week after the army hauled everything away, he claimed he found a fragment they'd missed no bigger than a coin, but with the same strange spring-back metal. He said he kept it in a tin box under his bed. If they knew I had it, he told Mac one night over a bottle of rye, I reckon they'd be knocking on my door before morning. The rumor that stirred the most unease, though, was harder to pin down. It began as a half-heard comment in the hardware store, then grew legs in the barber's chair, and by the time it reached the back tables of the tavern, it was something close to legend. Someone claimed no one seemed to know exactly who that the army hadn't just taken metal. They'd taken bodies. Small. Unusual. Not human in the way folks understood it. The story went that the shapes under those canvas tarps weren't just debris. That maybe whatever had come down in the desert wasn't just a machine, it was a vessel. And maybe it hadn't been empty when it fell. Mac didn't know what to make of it. He didn't much believe in flying saucers, and he'd certainly never heard of little green men outside of pulp magazines. But he couldn't shake the image of the army moving with such precision, such urgency. Not like they were cleaning up a weather balloon. More like they were removing something they wanted the world to forget. That night, lying awake in the dry desert heat, Mac thought about the strange metal and the beams with their purple markings. He thought about the way the sheep had avoided the wreckage. And he thought about the look in Major Marcel's eyes when he'd said, "It's not like anything you've seen before." The desert outside his window was silent. But Mac couldn't help feeling like something was still out there, just beyond sight, and that it was watching. The bodies rumor might have stayed just that, a drunken tale traded in hushed voices, if not for Bill Myers. Bill wasn't the kind of man people expected to stir up trouble. He worked nights at the gas station on Main Street, kept mostly to himself, and spoke slow, like every word had to be weighed before it left his mouth. One evening, just after sundown, Mac found him sitting on the edge of the station's back stoop, a cigarette glowing between his fingers. The street was quiet except for the faint clink of metal tools inside the garage. "You hear what they're saying?" Bill asked without preamble, eyes on the horizon. "Plenty of things," Mac replied. "Most of 'em nonsense." Bill took a slow drag. "Maybe. But I was out by the old arroyo the morning after that storm. Before the army put up their fences." Mac waited. Bill's hand trembled slightly as he tapped ash to the ground. "I saw them loading something into the back of a truck," Bill said. "Not metal. Not crates. They had tarps over it, but the wind caught one just enough. I saw an arm." Mac's brow furrowed. "An arm? Like a man's?" Bill shook his head. "Too thin. Too wrong. Skin was gray, smooth. Fingers longer than they should be. And the hand was curled in a way that didn't look right." "Could have been burned," Mac suggested. "In an accident, skin changes color." "No," Bill said firmly. "This wasn't burned. It wasn't human, Mac." The words hung between them, heavy in the cooling air. Bill went on to explain that within minutes, 2 soldiers spotted him. They didn't shout or threaten, just walked up calm as anything and told him it was best he head back to town. One of them, he said, rested a hand on his shoulder and gave it a slow, deliberate squeeze, not hard enough to hurt, but enough to make the meaning clear. "Didn't have to tell me twice," Bill said. "But I haven't slept right since." Mac didn't know whether to believe him. Bill didn't strike him as the type to chase stories, but he also knew the mind could twist what it saw, especially in moments of shock. Still, the detail about the long fingers gnawed at him. Over the next few days, more fragments of the same story bubbled up from different corners of town. A waitress at the diner swore a soldier had let something slip about specimens. A young boy claimed he'd seen a truck with a tarp stained dark in patches, as if with fluid. No one could prove anything, but the more the army tried to keep quiet, the louder the whispers became. Meanwhile, the military presence didn't fade. Jeeps still passed through town. Strange men in suits, not soldiers, not locals, were spotted speaking to shopkeepers and leaving without buying a thing. Some folks said they were government agents from Washington. Others muttered about men in black who could make a man forget what he'd seen. Late one night, as Mac stood on his porch staring at the endless sweep of desert, he thought he saw a light, small, distant, and moving low along the horizon. Not like a plane. Not like anything he could name. It blinked twice, hovered for a heartbeat, and then shot upward, vanishing into the dark. Mac stayed outside until the sun rose, waiting for it to return. It never did. But the feeling lingered, the sense that the desert was holding on to a truth the army couldn't fully bury. By mid-July 1947, the army's message was clear: the wreckage outside Roswell had been nothing more than a weather balloon. The explanation was repeated in the papers, on the radio, and in every statement the military released. Major Jesse Marcel, who had originally handled the debris, was now photographed holding torn balloon material, tin foil, balsa sticks, rubber sheeting. The image was printed in newspapers across the country. To most outsiders, it was enough. The story was over. But in Roswell, the picture didn't match the memory. Mac Brazel knew exactly what he had found on his ranch, and it wasn't balsa wood or the kind of foil that came from a balloon. The strange metal he'd held in his hand was gone, replaced in the official story by something that could crumple and tear like any child's kite. At the diner, Floyd slammed the paper down on the counter. "You believe this garbage?" he said to Mac. That's not what you showed me. That's not what you found. Mac only shook his head. Doesn't matter what I believe. The army says it's a balloon, and that's all anyone outside Roswell's ever gonna hear. It wasn't just the debris that had been replaced. The conversations in town grew clipped, cautious. People who had been eager to talk about bright lights and strange shapes now said little or nothing at all. Some admitted in quiet, tense moments that they'd been advised by uniformed men to stop spreading rumors. Others claimed they'd been visited at home, their families told that it was for the good of the country to forget what they'd seen. One afternoon, Sheriff Wilcox pulled Mac aside. His voice was low, his eyes tired. "You know I can't stop you from talking about it," he said. "But I'd think twice if I were you. You've got a family. This isn't a game." Mac didn't answer. The sheriff's meaning was clear. The strange thing was, the harder the army pushed the balloon story, the more people began to doubt it. They didn't have the whole truth, maybe they never would, but they could feel the weight of something unspoken pressing down on the town. In the weeks that followed, the soldiers began to disappear. The trucks stopped rolling through Main Street. The fences around the debris field came down, leaving only wind and dust where the mystery had been. But the silence didn't bring peace. Late one evening, Mac sat at his kitchen table, a single lamp casting shadows across the room. From his pocket, he pulled the last fragment he'd kept hidden, no bigger than a playing card, smooth and silver, impossibly light. He bent it once, twice. It sprang back without a mark. Whatever the army had taken, they hadn't taken everything. And Mac knew he would never throw it away. Time has a way of turning events into shadows, but in Roswell, 1947 never really left. The sheep pastures grew over, the old roads shifted, and the faces in town changed, but the whispers lingered like the desert wind, soft, persistent, impossible to catch. By the mid-1970s, the world had changed. Men had walked on the moon. Satellites circled the Earth. The idea of visitors from beyond the stars no longer belonged only to pulp magazines. And with that change came a spark. The Roswell story began to resurface. It started small. A retired Air Force officer, long since relocated to Texas, told a friend over coffee that the balloon explanation had been a cover. A reporter overheard and began digging. Soon, the phone calls started. Veterans, ranch hands, locals, all with pieces of the puzzle they had kept locked away for decades. Major Jesse Marcel, older now but still sharp-eyed, went on record in an interview. He spoke about the strange material, light as paper, impossible to dent, and how it had been replaced in front of the press. "It was not a weather balloon," he said firmly. His voice carried the weight of a man who'd kept quiet for too long. Mac Brazel, by then, was gone. But his children remembered the nights he'd sit on the porch, staring into the desert without a word. They remembered him telling them just once, "Don't believe everything you read in the papers. I know what I saw." Other witnesses began to surface. A nurse claimed she'd been called to the base hospital in 1947 and had glimpsed a small, sheet-covered shape in the corner of a restricted ward. A mortician said he'd been asked unusual questions about preserving bodies of non-standard size. Skeptics dismissed these accounts, but for believers, the pattern was undeniable: too many stories, too many details aligning after so many years. The U.S. government, faced with mounting questions, released a series of official reports. First, they acknowledged that the debris had been from Project Mogul, a top-secret balloon system designed to detect Soviet nuclear tests. Later, they admitted that the bodies some claimed to have seen were likely crash test dummies from unrelated experiments in the 1950s. But for many, these explanations felt like just another layer of the same story, a careful arrangement of facts that kept the real truth just out of reach. By the 1990s, Roswell had become something else entirely. Souvenir shops lined Main Street. UFO festivals drew thousands. The once quiet ranching town now wore its mystery proudly, part legend, part livelihood. Yet for those who had been there in 1947, the truth wasn't something to sell. It was something that still kept them awake at night. One summer evening, Jesse Marcel Jr., the major's son, a boy in 47 who had once held a piece of the strange wreckage in his small hands, stood on the very land where it had fallen. The wind whispered across the plain, and the stars stretched endlessly above. He bent down, scooped up a handful of dust, and let it drift away on the breeze. Somewhere out there, he thought, was the answer. And maybe, just maybe, it had been watching all along. The desert does not forget. It holds its secrets in the silence between the wind and the sand, in the shifting shadows of mesquite and sage. Men can dig it up, fence it off, and haul away what they find, but the land keeps the memory in its own way, in its own time. Decades after that summer storm in 1947, the place where Mac Brazel found the glittering debris looks like any other stretch of New Mexico plain. The grass grows sparse, the soil hard and red under the sun. To a stranger, it is empty land. But those who know the story really know it feels something different here. They say that on certain nights, when the moon is thin and the wind comes low from the west, the air hums faintly, like the echo of distant machinery. They say the sheep still avoid a narrow strip of ground where nothing grows quite right. And sometimes, far off above the hills, a light will appear too fast for a plane, too smooth for a shooting star, and then vanish without a trace. The army's files are closed now. The names of those who guarded the wreckage are etched into headstones or buried in yellowed records. The witnesses are fewer with each passing year. And yet, the question lingers, maybe stronger than ever. Was it a machine from another world? A secret project buried under patriotic silence? Or something stranger still, something that does not fit into the boxes we build for our understanding? The desert will not say. It will keep its counsel, as it always has. But every so often, someone will stand on that lonely stretch of land, listen to the quiet, and feel the hair rise on their arms. Because deep down, they'll sense it too, that something once came here from the sky, something not meant for this place. And though men may lie, and papers may burn, and decades may pass, the desert remembers.